The lights had dimmed hours ago, but laughter still lingered in the air. The smell of champagne and roses hung heavy in the room, sweet and suffocating. Lily's wedding had been perfect, the kind of day people dreamed about. The kind of day my parents had dreamed about for her since we were children. I watched from a distance as guests drifted away, their heels clicking softly on marble floors, their voices fading like music from another life. The bride and groom were still glowing, her cheeks flushed, his arm firm around her waist. They looked like a painting, one that could hang in any gallery and still be called happiness. And there I was, the invisible brushstroke, the color no one noticed but without which the painting would never be complete. When the music stopped, I slipped outside. The night air was cold against my skin, cooling the warmth I didn't deserve to feel. The city lights shimmered below, each one a tiny echo of something I couldn't reach anymore. Behind me, I could still hear them, the laughter, the clinking glasses. My mother's voice calling Lily's name with the kind of pride that had never been meant for me. I wanted to cry, but tears felt too small for the ache in my chest. So I just stood there quietly, watching the world move on without me. It wasn't jealousy anymore. That word was too easy, too shallow. What I felt was something slower, like erosion, like watching your own reflection fade from a mirror day after day until it no longer startles you. I had learned long ago that love in our family wasn't measured equally. Lily was the light. I was the shadow that proved she was shining. And shadows don't get thanked. They just make the light look brighter. Later that night, after the last guest had gone and the music had stopped, I helped clean up. Mom told me I didn't have to. But that's what I'd always been good at, staying behind to make things right after everyone else left. You've always been dependable, Anna, she said softly. Your sister is lucky to have you. I smiled, but inside, something fragile tilted and cracked. Dependable. It sounded so much like invisible when she said it. After the wedding, Lily and her husband left for Italy, a honeymoon in Florence, the city of art, of love, of everything I once wanted. I went back to my small apartment, to my quiet job at the gallery, to evenings spent with the sound of pencils on paper instead of voices. For a while, I tried to pretend I was fine, but pretending is exhausting work. And one night, I realized I couldn't remember the last time anyone had said my name with warmth. Weeks passed. Mom called often, mostly to talk about Lily. They've sent postcards. The photos are stunning. She looks so happy. Her husband just bought her a new studio for painting. Each word was a stone added to a wall between us. I answered kindly. I asked questions. I played the role I'd been cast in all my life, the good listener, the quiet one. When the call ended, I sat in silence, the dial tone humming like a flat line. That sound felt familiar, because somewhere along the way, part of me had already died. Months later, Lily came back. They moved into a bright apartment downtown. Large windows, white curtains, the kind of place sunlight loved. She invited us for dinner. Mom brought wine. Dad brought stories. I brought flowers I couldn't afford. It was a beautiful evening on the surface. Beneath it, everything was the same. Lily laughed, her hand resting on her husband's arm, and Mom's eyes shone like the world had never known such joy. I smiled. I always did. But when Lily turned to me and said, "You should paint again, Anna," I felt something twist inside. Because the last time I had painted, it was her face I'd tried to forget. That night, I couldn't sleep. The city lights flickered outside my window, and every flash of brightness felt like a reminder that I was still stuck in the dim places of my life. I thought about leaving, not forever, just long enough to breathe, to see if the world could look at me without seeing her first. By morning, the thought had turned into something sharper, a need. So I packed a small suitcase, just clothes, sketchbooks, and a letter I never sent. Mom called as I was about to leave. "Where are you going?" "Just away for a while," I said. "You can't just leave, Anna," she said, her voice tightening. "Your sister might need you." I laughed softly. It wasn't cruel, just tired. "That's the point, Mom," I said quietly. "She's always needed me, and I've never known what it feels like to be needed for myself." Before she could answer, I hung up. Then I left. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. I just drove, past the suburbs, past the towns with names I'd never remember, until the landscape opened into something wide and silent. By the time the sun rose, I was in a new city, small, quiet, by the coast. The kind of place where people didn't ask questions, where everyone looked like they were running from something. I fit right in. The first few weeks were empty. The silence was both a comfort and a wound. No phone calls, no expectations, no voices saying you understand, just me. And for the first time, that was terrifying. Because when you've spent your life being defined by others, it's like being lost. But slowly, I began to breathe again, to draw again, not for beauty, not for meaning, just to survive. I rented a small room above an old cafe. The owner, a quiet woman named Rosa, let me pay in paintings. You paint feelings, she said once, not faces. I smiled faintly, because that was true. I didn't want to remember faces anymore. Faces belonged to the past, and the past had already taken enough. The first night in the new city was too quiet. The walls of the apartment were thin, and I could hear the faint hum of a refrigerator, the occasional cough from the neighbor next door, and the wind moving through the cracks in the window frame. No voices, no footsteps. No Anna, could you? Or Anna, please help your sister. Just space. And the kind of silence that doesn't comfort you, it studies you, waits for you to speak first. I couldn't, because I didn't yet know what to say in a world where no one was listening. The apartment was small, one room, one window, one fragile light bulb. The walls were pale, the kind of pale that made you wonder if they used to be whiter, if time had simply taken the color away. There was a single wooden desk, a narrow bed, and a chair that creaked every time I moved. It wasn't home, but it wasn't my parents' house either. And maybe that was enough. I unpacked slowly, placing my sketchbooks on the desk, my pencils in a chipped mug I found in the cupboard. On the wall, I hung one small painting, the only one I'd taken from my old apartment. It was a painting of a window at dawn. Outside, the sky was blue-gray, the color of hope. When it's too tired to be bright, I stared at it for a long time that night. Not because it was beautiful, but because it was mine. And that was something I hadn't felt in years. Days turned into weeks, and the city began to unfold itself to me. It wasn't loud, but it wasn't dead either. There was a cafe on the corner where old men played chess every morning, a bookstore that smelled like rain and tobacco, and the sea always close enough to smell, never close enough to touch. I started walking every day. At first, just to move. Then, because walking was the only team I didn't have to think. People in this city didn't stare. They didn't ask questions. Everyone seemed to be running from something, and maybe that's why they left each other alone. It was the first time in my life I felt invisible by choice. I found work at a small art shop by the coast. The owner, Rosa, was the kind that doesn't ask for anything in return. She sold handmade frames, local paintings, and postcards that tourists sometimes bought but never really looked at. I spent my days cleaning brushes, rearranging canvases, listening to the sound of waves muffled through the thin walls. You're quiet, Rosa said one afternoon. I like quiet, I replied. Quiet people usually think too much, she said. Do you? I didn't answer, because the truth was, thinking was all I ever did. At night, I painted. The desk by the window became my anchor. Every stroke of the brush was like a breath, uneven, necessary. At first, I painted the sea, because it was always there, vast, constant, unreachable. Then I painted empty rooms, hands reaching for things that weren't there, faces turned away. I didn't paint Lily, but somehow, every face I drew looked a little like hers. Anyway, one night, I tried painting myself, but the more I painted, the more I erased, until all that was left was a shadow. And maybe that was who I'd been all along, not a person, just the outline of one. Letters came sometimes, mostly from Lily. How are you? Mom worries about you. Dad says you're being too hard on yourself. I miss you, Anna. I read them. I even smiled at some, but I never replied, because I knew how it would go. She would write, I would forgive, and then I'd disappear again. And I was tired of disappearing, so I folded the letters carefully, placed them in a small box, and hid it in the drawer under my bed, out of sight, out of forgiveness. Winter came early that year. The sea grew darker, the streets emptier. The cafe closed before sunset, and Rosa started giving me tea instead of coffee. You should visit your family, she said once gently. It's been a long time. They have each other, I said quietly. And you? I have silence. She looked at me for a long moment, then nodded. Silence is heavy. Be careful not to drown in it. I smiled faintly. But that night, I dreamed of drowning, the kind that doesn't come with panic, just the slow acceptance of being swallowed by what you can't escape. One evening, I walked to the cliffs by the sea. The wind was sharp, salt in the air, the world painted in shades of blue and gray. I sat on a rock and watched the water move endlessly below. It struck me then how much the ocean reminded me of Lily. Beautiful, loud, alive, and always taking up more space than it realized. And me, I was the shore, constantly reshaped by her waves, but never allowed to move first. The thought made me smile, a small, bitter smile, because maybe, even in this new city, I was still living in her shadow. Sometimes I saw couples walking along the pier holding hands, laughing, their voices carried away by the wind. It used to make me sad. Now it just made me tired. Because love, I realized, wasn't always warm. Sometimes it was just another kind of gravity, something that kept you tethered to the Pia Pluho broke you. I painted a lot that winter, canvas after canvas, faces without names, hands reaching for nothing, rooms filled with light that couldn't warm. Rosa started hanging them in the shop. People like them, she said. They say your art feels honest. I wanted to laugh, because honesty was the only thing I had left. When you've lost everything else, truth becomes the only thing that doesn't leave. One afternoon, I caught my reflection in the shop window. For a second, I didn't recognize myself. The woman staring back looked older, not in years, but in weight, the kind of weight that doesn't show on scales. I traced the outline of my reflection with my finger on the glass, and I whispered, "You made it out." The reflection didn't answer, but I think she heard me. Weeks later, Rosa told me a man had bought one of my paintings. He didn't leave a name, she said, but he said it reminded him of loss. Loss. That word again. It followed me like a ghost, soft, persistent, familiar. Sometimes I wondered if I'd ever create anything that didn't hurt. But then I realized maybe hurting was the only way I knew how to be real. That night, I painted until dawn. When I finished, I stepped back and stared at it. It was a woman standing at a train station, her suitcase open, the wind scattering pages from a book she never finished writing. In her eyes, there was no fear, only distance. I titled it The Ones Who Leave, and for the first time, I signed it with my full name. Not Anna the daughter, not Anna the sister, just Anna. It happened on a Tuesday, the kind of Tuesday that felt like any other gray sky, salt in the air, the smell of wet paint lingering in the shop. I was restocking frames in the back room when Rosa called out, "Anna, there's someone here to see you." I hesitated. No one ever came to see me. When I stepped out, there was a man standing near the window, tall, quiet, with a coat that looked too heavy for spring. He was holding one of my paintings, The Ones Who Leave. "You're the artist?" he asked. His voice was calm, low, the kind that made words sound softer than they were. I nodded. "I am." He looked back at the painting. "I bought this a few weeks ago, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. Most people forget my work once they leave," I said, trying to sound like it didn't matter. He smiled faintly. "Then I must not be most people." We talked for a while, or rather, he talked, and I listened, the way I always did. His name was Elias. He was a photographer, used to travel, he said, until one day the world stopped feeling worth capturing. "Your painting," he said quietly, "it looks like someone who left before the world gave her permission." I didn't answer. He wasn't wrong. "Why did you paint her?" he asked. "Because I needed to see what it looked like," I said. "Leaving? No, surviving it." He didn't respond for a long time. Then softly, "You paint grief like someone who's been introduced to it too many times." I looked at him, then really looked, and for a second, I forgot how to hide. "Maybe grief and I are on a first-name basis," I said. "We stopped pretending to be strangers a long time ago." He smiled, but there was no pity in it, only recognition. That made it worse, because pity you can dismiss, recognition stays. Elias started visiting the shop every week, never with an appointment, never with a reason. Sometimes he'd buy a painting, sometimes he'd just sit and talk to Rosa while I worked. I didn't ask why, but part of me began to wait for it. The sound of the doorbell, the smell of cold air when he stepped inside, the quiet way he'd nod at me from across the room. We never spoke of family, or love, or the kind of things that make people flinch. But once, as I was cleaning brushes, he said, "You paint people who are looking for something they've already lost." I stopped. Maybe because I am one of them. "And did you find it?" "No," I said, but I stopped running after it. He studied me for a long time, then said something I never forgot. Sometimes, the only way to heal from being unseen is to stop asking to be looked at. It was such a simple thing to say, but it felt like someone had opened a window in a locked room. I didn't thank him, but that night, I slept without dreaming for the first time in years. As weeks turned to months, his presence became a quiet rhythm in my days. He never overstepped, never asked for what I couldn't give. Sometimes he'd bring me photographs, black and white shots of cities, faces, shadows. "You see light the same way I do," he said once, "through the things it can't quite reach." I didn't know whether that was a compliment or a confession. Maybe both, because in a strange way, we were the same kind of broken people who knew what it meant to live after the story was supposed to end. One evening, the shop was empty except for us. Rosa had gone home early. Rain tapped gently against the window. Elias stood by one of my newer paintings, a small piece unfinished. "She looks like you," he said. "She's not," I replied. "Who is she then?" "The part of me that stayed when I left." He turned to face me. "Do you ever think about going back?" The question hung in the air, heavy and dangerous. I shook my head slowly. "There's nothing there for me anymore. Not even forgiveness? Especially not forgiveness." He nodded, as if he understood. Then he said quietly, "Sometimes, we don't forgive because we're angry. We forgive because it's the only way to stop being haunted." His words sat with me long after he left, but they didn't comfort me. They just hurt in a quieter way, because I didn't want to stop being haunted. The ghosts were all I had left of who I'd been. A few days later, a letter arrived. It was from my father. I hadn't heard from him in years. "Your mother's things are being sorted," it read. "Lily's helping. She asked about you. I don't know what to tell her anymore. I hope you're well, Dad." I stared at it for a long time, then tore it in half. Not out of hate, but out of exhaustion. Because there's a point where apologies stop being medicine and start tasting like poison. That evening, Elias found me still sitting behind the counter. "You okay?" he asked. "Just a letter," I said, "from the people who taught me how to disappear." He didn't ask to see it. He didn't tell me to go back. He just said, "You don't owe them your return, but you do owe yourself a life that isn't built around leaving." And somehow, those words were worse than silence, because they made me realize I was still standing at the edge, not falling, but not walking away either. A week later, he brought me a photograph. It was of a lone figure standing in a train station, the same composition as the ones who leave. But this time, the figure wasn't facing away. She was looking straight ahead. "It reminded me of you," he said, "of what you might look like when you finally stop waiting." I wanted to tell him I didn't know how to stop waiting. That even in this city, with its sea and its silence, I was still waiting for something, a letter, a reason, a moment that would make it all make sense. But instead, I said, "It's beautiful." He smiled. Maybe beauty is what happens when pain learns how to stand still. I didn't understand what he meant then, but I would, later. That night, I dreamed of the house I grew up in. The lights were on, laughter spilled out of the windows. Lily was there, Mom too, but when I walked closer, the door was locked. Through the glass, I saw them look up and keep laughing. I knocked. No one heard, so I turned around and walked into the dark. And when I looked back, the house was gone. When I woke up, the morning light filled the room. Soft, golden, unforgiving. I sat by the window, watching the sea. Elias's words replayed in my mind. "You don't owe them your return." Maybe he was right. Maybe some stories don't need closure. Maybe surviving was the only ending I was ever meant to have. But the ache didn't fade. It never does. It just learned how to hide better. The sea had become a mirror. Every morning, it looked the same, gray, patient, endless. It didn't ask questions. It didn't answer them either. It just was. And maybe that's why I came here every day, because the sea didn't need me to be anyone. It didn't care if I was the forgotten daughter, the silent sister, the woman who left. It just kept moving, steady, unforgiving. Rosa used to tell me that people who come to the coast Alani are either trying to find something or trying to bury it. I wasn't sure which one I was doing anymore. Sometimes, I'd sit on the rocks for hours, the wind clawing at my hair, the waves crawling closer, and I'd think, maybe the ocean understands loss better than anyone. It takes and takes, but never apologizes. It simply calls it the tide. It had been months since I'd seen Elias. He'd gone to photograph the mountains in the north. He said he needed distance to breathe. I understood. Distance had been my only language for years. He left a note before he went. Don't forget that you exist outside the things that broke you. I kept it folded inside my sketchbook, unread but never thrown away. Some words are too heavy to face, even when they're kind. One evening, after Rosa closed the shop, I stayed behind to clean. The smell of turpentine and rain filled the air. As I was stacking the canvases, a small box fell from the shelf. It was old, covered in dust, my name written on it in Lily's handwriting. I froze. It must have come with the last shipment of supplies. She worked with a gallery now. Maybe she'd send it without realizing it would find me here. I sat down, heart trembling, and opened it. Inside were letters, dozens of them, all addressed to me. The first one was dated 3 years ago. Anna, I don't know where you are. Mom says you're fine, but I can hear the lie in her voice. I still paint the things we used to draw together, the windows, the sky, the light, but they never look the same without you. I wish I could tell you I understand. I don't. I just miss you. I closed it quickly, but the second one called to me. Anna, I found one of your old sketches. The one of the girl standing at the train station. I didn't realize until now that she was you. I think you were trying to leave long before you actually did. I felt my throat tighten. Because she was right. I'd been leaving all my life in pieces, in silences, in the spaces between words. I read the next few letters slowly, each one softer than the last, like her voice fading with distance. I'm married now, Anna. I wish you could have been there. Mom is sick. She asks about you sometimes. I think she wants to say sorry, but doesn't know where to start. Dad doesn't talk much anymore. Sometimes he just sits by the window, like he's waiting for something, maybe for you. I stopped reading. My hands were shaking. The paper felt heavy, like it carried the weight of everything I'd tried to leave behind. But there was one more letter at the bottom, the last one, unsealed. Anna, I don't know if this will reach you. I just wanted to say I understand now. What it's like to be loved too loudly while someone else fades in the same room. I think I finally see what it did to you. And I'm sorry I took the light when you needed it most. Wherever you are, I hope the world is softer with you than we ever were. I pressed the paper to my chest and let the tears come quietly. They didn't fall fast. They just slipped through, like they'd been waiting for years. The next morning, I brought the letters with me to the sea. The wind was calm, the sky pale. I sat on the same rock I always died in, started reading them aloud, one by one. To no one, to everyone. Each word seemed to drift into the water, carried away like pieces of a life that no longer fit me. When I finished, I stacked the letters, tied them with a red string, and placed them on the sand. The tide reached for them slowly, then took them, and I let it. Because maybe some stories don't belong to the people who live them but to the ones who stayed behind. That evening, the sea was quiet again. I watched the horizon, wondering if Lily ever stood by her own window, watching the same sun disappear. Maybe she did. Maybe she thought of me. But thinking of each other wasn't the same as finding each other. And that realization that love could exist without closeness was both freeing and unbearable. When the light began to fade, I stood and looked at the water one last time. You were right, Lily, I whispered. I was trying to leave long before I ever did. The wind carried my voice away, and I smiled. Not because I felt peace, but because I finally accepted that I might never find it. And maybe that was okay, because some people aren't meant to heal. Some people are meant to remember. That night, I painted again, a single canvas, large, empty at first. Then, slowly, a shape emerged, the curve of a shoreline, the reflection of light on water, a woman standing at the edge of the sea, her hands open, not reaching, just letting go. I titled it The Forgiveness That Never Came, and when the paint dried, I didn't sign it, because it wasn't just mine anymore. Winter came quietly that year. No warning, no storm, just a slow fading of color, until even the sea looked tired. The tourists had gone. The streets were empty. The cafe where I used to buy coffee had closed for the season, its windows fogged with salt and silence. The town became a skeleton, bare, fragile, and familiar. It felt like home. I had lived here for nearly 8 years. Sometimes it felt like a lifetime. Other times, like I'd only arrived yesterday. Time, I learned, doesn't move the same way when you're alone. It stretches and folds, like light through fog, never really gone, never really clear. My hair had grown longer, my hands were thinner, my reflection in the mirror looked softer, almost translucent, as if I was slowly becoming part of the room. I still painted, not for galleries, not for money, just because the world felt too heavy to carry without color. The paintings filled every corner of my apartment, the walls, the floors, even the back of the door. Rosa used to joke that my home looked like a museum for ghosts who still remembered what it felt like to breathe. She wasn't wrong. Rosa was older now, her hands shaking when she poured tea. She still ran the art shop, though fewer people came these days. You should sell your work again, she told me one morning. People ask about the artist who paints silence. I smiled faintly. Silence doesn't belong to me. It belongs to everyone who's ever been forgotten. She looked at me with something between love and worry. You speak like someone who's already halfway gone. Maybe I was. Maybe I had been for years. Sometimes I walked along the beach at dawn. The sea in winter was a different creature, darker, slower, like it had finally grown tired of pretending to be beautiful. I liked it that way. I'd collect small shells, smooth stones, bits of driftwood, things the water had given up. They reminded me of myself, of all the pieces I'd left behind somewhere I no longer belonged. People in town began to talk about my paintings. They said they could feel something in them. Grief, maybe, or memory, or the echo of something once alive. A few of them found their way to small galleries. The owners would ask for my name. Rosa would just smile and say, "She doesn't sign her work." It became a mystery, a myth almost. The nameless painter by the sea, the woman who painted sorrow like it was sunlight. I didn't correct them, because myths can't be disappointed. People can. Every winter, the town grew quieter. Old friends moved away. New faces came and went like passing tides. But the sea, it stayed. I'd sit by my window at night and watch the lights flicker along the shore, each one belonging to someone who still believed in warmth. I didn't envy them anymore. Not really. I had learned how to make peace with a life that asked for nothing and gave even less. One afternoon, Rosa came to my apartment. She looked tired, wrapped in a shawl that smelled like wood smoke and lavender. "You should write to them," she said suddenly. "Your family." I laughed softly. They wouldn't know what to do with me now. Maybe you don't give them enough credit. Or maybe I've given them too much, I said. She sighed. "You can't live your whole life in exile, Anna." "It's not exile," I whispered. "It's peace." But even as I said it, the word didn't sound honest. Because peace wasn't what I felt. It was more like numbness dressed as forgiveness. That night, I dreamt of Lily again. She was standing in a garden, holding a child, a little girl with her eyes. She looked at me and smiled. "She paints, you know," she said, "just like you." The child reached for me, but before I could touch her, the garden faded into mist. When I woke, my pillow was wet with tears. I didn't remember crying. Days passed, then weeks. The air grew colder, the horizon turned silver, and one morning, I woke to find snow falling over the sea. It was the first snow in years, tiny flakes drifting down, melting before they touched the water. I stood outside, the cold biting at my hands, and for a brief moment, everything was silent. Not the heavy kind of silence that pressed on your chest, but the light, fragile kind that feels like mercy. That afternoon, I painted again. A large canvas, the biggest one I'd ever made. The scene was simple. A woman standing in falling snow, the ocean behind her, her face turned away. She wasn't sad. She wasn't happy. She was simply there, existing in the quiet between one breath and the next. I titled it Winter Doesn't Ask Why. Rosa cried when she saw it. It's beautiful, she whispered. It feels like goodbye. Maybe it was. The next morning, Rosa came to the shop and found a note on the counter. It was in my handwriting. Thank you for the silence. There was no address, no explanation, no signature. Just those 5 words. I didn't leave much behind: a few brushes, unfinished sketches, and a small shell on the windowsill. They said the apartment was empty, but it wasn't. It was full of all the things I never said. In the months that followed, rumors spread. Some said I'd moved to another country. Some said I'd gone to live with family. Others whispered that I'd walked into the sea one night, and the tide never brought me back. No one ever proved any of it. But every spring, when the snow melted and the sea turned blue again, small paintings would appear on Rosa's doorstep, each one signed with a single letter A. Rosa never sold them. She hung them all in the shop one by one, until the walls became a quiet cathedral of memory. People came from other towns just to see them. They said the paintings made them feel something they couldn't name, something like loss, something like home. And when they asked who the artist was, Rosa would smile softly and say, just someone who finally learned how to disappear beautifully. Years later, Lily came to the coast, older now, with silver in her hair. She found Rosa, still sitting by the window of the shop. I think she was my sister, Lily said quietly. Her name was Anna. Rosa nodded. I know. Lily looked at the walls, at all the paintings, the sea, the snow, the woman always facing away. She pressed a hand to her mouth and began to cry. She never forgave me, did she? Rosa looked out at the horizon, where the sky met the sea. I don't think she needed to, she said. She just needed to paint until the pain stopped echoing. Lily stood there for a long time, until the sun began to set. Then she whispered, goodbye, Anna, and the wind carried her words into the endless, forgiving sea. It had been almost 10 years since anyone had seen her. The woman who painted silence, the nameless artist by the sea, the ghost who turned pain into color. By then, even Rosa was gone. The little art shop closed, its windows boarded up. Its sign faded to a whisper of what once was. But the paintings remained, hung in small museums, private collections, homes of strangers who didn't know her name but felt her heartbeat in every brushstroke. They called her the Woman of Winter, the painter who vanished without a trace and left behind nothing but light. One day, a curator from New York visited a small coastal gallery in a forgotten corner of the country. The gallery owner, an old man with gentle eyes, showed her a collection that had been donated years ago. Dozens of seascapes, portraits turned away, hands reaching towards something unseen. They say she lived here once, he told her. No one knew her real name, but the locals said her art could quiet a storm. The curator studied the paintings for hours. There was something familiar in the lines, a tenderness carved out of sorrow, a silence that spoke louder than grief. Then she saw it. At the back of the room, covered in a thin layer of dust, stood a single painting, large, unframed, its edges worn from age. It showed a woman standing before the ocean, the waves curling at her feet, her back to the viewer, her hands open as if releasing something into the wind. The light in the sky was strange, neither dawn nor dusk, but something in between. The kind of light that belonged to people who no longer needed to choose between staying and leaving. At the bottom corner, faint but clear, was a signature. Just one letter. The curator asked where it came from. The old man shrugged. No one knows. It was found in the attic when Rosa died. There was a note with it. He handed her a small, folded piece of paper. The ink had bled from age, but the handwriting was still steady, precise, familiar, deliberate. It read, "This is the last one. Paint it for the ones who stayed. Leave it for the ones who finally understood." No name, just that. The curator's breath caught. She felt, for reasons she couldn't explain, that this wasn't just art. It was a confession. The painting was shipped to New York a few months later, restored, framed, displayed in a quiet corner of a new exhibit called Women of Silence. People came and stood before it for long minutes. They didn't always know why they were crying. Some said it reminded them of someone they lost. Others said it felt like standing on the edge of a memory you couldn't step back from. One woman whispered, "It looks like forgiveness." Another said, "No, it looks like freedom." Both were right. Because forgiveness and freedom were always two sides of the same ache. A few months after the exhibit opened, a visitor came late one evening, an older woman with silver hair and eyes that had learned to live with regret. Her name was Lily. She stood quietly in front of the painting for a long time. The guard said she didn't move for nearly an hour. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a breath. "You found your sky, Anna?" Tears slipped down her face. But her smile was soft. "I spent my whole life looking for you in the places you left behind. I didn't know you'd been here all along waiting in the light." She reached out, her hand trembling just inches from the canvas, and whispered, "I see you now." The guard later said she stayed until the lights dimmed. When she left, she turned one last time to look, and the fading glow from the gallery window made it seem like the woman in the painting had finally turned her head and smiled. That winter, the museum released a book about Anna's work. They called it The Light Between Sisters. No one knew the whole story. And somewhere in some place no one could name, a woman sat by the sea, her hands stained with paint, her heart no longer heavy. She didn't need the world to know her name anymore, because she had already painted it 1,000 times, in every color that ever meant love, loss, and everything in between. A woman standing before the sea, her back to the world, her hands open, her silence, finally understood.